Hello everyone. Dates play a very important role in our lives. Take for example birthdays. We celebrate birthdays of our close ones, our family members, our friends, teachers. That day represents the birth of that particular individual, and celebrating that day marks the respect and celebration of that person's contribution in our lives. Another example can be India is celebrating its 75th year of its independence, and many activities have been conducted to celebrate this 75th year. Now the entire year will be celebrated as remembrance of the sacrifices done by our forefathers. So that is why when we look at all this, we can come to a conclusion that dates are very important for us. Now let us try to gauge how important are the dates for our history with an example of British rule in India. In olden days, historians were obsessed with dates and events. Historians would keep a record of events happening and the dates associated with it. And these records would then become part of our history. Now, whenever an event is to occur, it would be written down in history. And then the events which happened before that particular event and after the event are then easier to analyze. That is why a record of history becomes a very important document to analyze what happened during that particular event and what were the repercussions or what happened after that event. Humans have in general three tendencies. First one is the ability to wonder. Take for example, we visit an ancient temple. When we look at the temple, we tend to wonder when it was built, who built it, who was the king then, what was the era, from where did they get the stone, which architecture they have followed. All these kinds of questions will be coming in our minds. Just because we are curious to know, we would definitely need records, and that is when history comes into picture. Like I have said, when we talk about dates in history, there are two aspects which we need to keep in mind. First is dates and the next one is the event. Take for example, one war has been fought. So the event becomes the war which has been fought, and the date on which the war had started, or the date at which the war had ended, or the period of war, that becomes important. So in this case, date and event both become important. Continuing this example, let us see how the historians periodize this date. Now let us first know what is periodization. When historians write history, they basically periodize the entire event. Now what is this periodization? To know this concept, let us take one example from our history. In 1817, James Mill, a Scottish economist and a political philosopher, wrote a book in 3 volumes. The name of the book was The History of British India. James Mill divided the entire history into 3 different parts, or I would say 3 different periods. Now this period were Hindu period, Muslim period and the British period. He basically compartmentalized the entire history into the Hindu rule, the Muslim rule and then the British rule. This made it easier for him to write the entire history of British India. Mill was influenced by British administration. So basically what he did was he tried to compare the Muslim rule, the Hindu rule to the British rule. Britishers used to feel that the Europeans were superior and the Indians were inferior. They thought that they have come here doing a favor and will help them to develop and civilize, which was obviously a wrong notion. But then they were ruling the country, and that is why these ideologies were flourishing. Now with this example, we came to know that the entire history of British India was divided into 3 periods. With this example, I would like to give you the definition of periodization. Periodization simply means demarcating the differences between 2 periods. Periodization basically reflects the ideas from the past. It also shows the significant changes from one period to the next. I would like to explain periodization with one more example which is relevant to today's world. Take for example, the history is categorized into 3 major parts, that is the ancient, the medieval and the modern history. Like I have said in my earlier statement, periodization shows us the significant change from one period to another. With this example of ancient, medieval and modern history, in this example, modern history becomes the parameters to judge the history of the earlier two periods, that is the ancient and the medieval. In modern history, there are various parameters on which we judge the earlier period. The modern parameters can be science, democracy, equality, modernity, etc. Once we have the records of the ancient history, the medieval history and the modern history, we tend to compare and try to show the significant difference or the changes that have occurred from one period to another period. Carrying forward the example of the British rule in India, I would like to explain the term colonization. Colonization basically means when the subjugation of one country by another leads to political, economic, social and cultural changes. Like we all know, Britishers came to India with the purpose of trade, and slowly and steadily they took over the entire country, resulting in economic, social and political changes in our country. This led to vast level of exploitation and our resources being utilized by the Britishers, leaving the country in extreme poverty. The records of colonial era and the rule of Britishers in India have given us various historical factors. Let us analyze these factors with the importance of dates and events. Now, how do we know the actual history? First and the foremost, we can go to the administrative records of those days. With the example of British rule in India, the Britishers were very good in administration. They would keep the record of their administrative proceedings with them. These records were in the form of instructions, plans, policy decisions, agreements and investigation. These documents helped the British administration in issuing memos, noting and writing reports. Another important way of gathering information of historical record is documents and letters. The Britishers were running the administration with various offices spread across the country, namely district offices, collectorate, the commissioner's office, provincial secretariats and the law courts. Now all these administrative offices had their own storehouse where they would store this data, which would then be processed. Britishers were also fond of archives and museums. So many of these documents and artifacts which can give us a glimpse of our history were preserved in our archives and museums. In the earliest British rule, all this documentation was handwritten, but with the invention of printing, these documents were then be printed and saved. This helped them to preserve the documents over a longer period of time, and that is the reason why we still find them, and they are the ones who are giving us the glimpses of our history. Another very important medium of gathering information for the Britishers was conducting survey. Britishers knew that they were ruling a big country. So to rule this, they should know what lies and where it is. For example, the resources. Only when they know where the resources lie, these surveys would give them all sort of data which then they could use to exploit our resources. Britishers started with mapping the entire country. They also conducted a revenue survey. This helped them to know which part of the countries can generate more revenue. Another form of surveys could be topography, soil quality and flora and fauna. One of the most important survey according to me which the Britishers carried out was religion, caste and occupation. The repercussions of these kind of surveys even led to partition of India. Apart from these surveys, there were surveys like botanical survey, zoological, archaeological, anthropological and forest survey. The data gathered from this survey would then be analyzed and the records will be produced in which they had saved for the future use. This gave us an idea of the actual situation then. Now all these records which the Britishers had compiled basically were from their viewpoint. It was their official thought. All these records were with the sole purpose of understanding and trying to know the resources at their disposal which then they can exploit. So now what are the other ways of getting authentic, true information which can show us the actual history of the country? Now here are some ways by which we can get authentic historical information. First one is diaries of people. People have this habit of writing diaries. So if anyone, any historian finds a diary written in that particular era by eminent person or the person who was actually involved in the happenings, then that can be used to find the true history. Another way can be accounts of pilgrimage and travelers. The European countries would send travelers on the journey to discover new land. These travelers would then return to the country with all the data which they have gathered about those countries. This data would then be analyzed by the European countries who had sent these travelers, and then it would be used to attain their aims and objectives, which was basically colonizing these countries. Autobiographies of eminent people Booklets written during the era of the actual event, the daily newspaper can be a very important document to write history. And last but not the least, all the writings which happened during that period can be used to find out about the history. In this session, we have gained knowledge about the importance of dates and events, how the early historians the record, how the Britishers used these records for their purpose, different ways of finding authentic information. So this is all in the session. See you in the next session.